My name is Ruth, and I'm 67 years old. I never thought the people I loved most would make me question the very meaning of family. For most of my life, this farm has been more than just land, it's been my heartbeat. 40 acres of rolling green fields, golden in summer and quiet in winter, passed down through 4 generations of my family. My husband, Harold, and I poured our souls into it. We built our home here, raised our daughter here, and spent decades learning that peace doesn't come from wealth, it comes from honest work and the smell of fresh soil after rain. When Harold passed away 8 years ago, I thought the loneliness would swallow me whole. The only thing that kept me standing was the farm. The land never left me. It never judged me. It simply asked to be cared for. My daughter, Nora, lives 2 towns over. She's a good woman, though we've had our share of disagreements over the years. And my grandson, Jake, well, Jake was always my heart. I still remember the way his tiny hands would reach for mine when he was a boy, how his laughter would echo through the barn while he chased the chickens he swore were plotting against him. I was so proud of him. I thought, one day, he'd grow into the kind of man Harold was: kind, steady, humble. But time has a cruel way of changing people. As Jake grew older, the sweetness faded. He started visiting less. And when he did, he was always in a rush, his eyes glued to his phone, his mind somewhere else. He stopped talking about his life and started asking about mine, or rather, about what I owned. It began with harmless curiosity. "Grandma, how big is the farm again?" Then it turned into something sharper. "Who's it going to when you're gone?" At first, I laughed it off. "Don't rush me into the grave just yet," I'd tease. But the questions didn't stop. Every time he came over, there was another version of the same conversation. "You know, Grandma, I could manage the place better," he'd say. "You shouldn't be working so hard at your age." It was always dressed up as concern, but there was something hollow underneath, something greedy. I tried to ignore it, telling myself he was just young and ambitious, that he didn't mean any harm. But the tone of his voice told another story. About 3 years ago, a woman named Ellen bought the property next to mine. She was in her early 40s, divorced, and looking to start over. I remember the first time she came by to introduce herself. She brought a basket of fresh apples and a smile so warm it felt like sunlight. Over time, she became a dear friend. She'd help me fix fences, bring soup when I wasn't feeling well, and always made sure I never spent the holidays alone. Jake, however, despised her from the start. "That woman is bad news," he said one evening, after seeing her truck parked in my driveway. "You don't even know her." I asked him what made him think that, and he just shook his head, muttering something about her taking advantage of old people. I brushed it off at first, but his hatred of her only grew. He refused to visit when she was around and would make snide remarks about her whenever her name came up. I never understood it. Ellen was kind, respectful, and asked for nothing from me. Jake, on the other hand, had started asking for everything. Then one Sunday afternoon, he came by unannounced. His car tore up the gravel driveway like a storm, dust trailing behind him. He didn't even greet me when he walked in, just dropped his phone on the table and said, "Grandma, we need to talk." He told me he wanted the farm. Not someday. Now. He said it like a demand, not a request. "You're not getting any younger," he said flatly. "It's time to pass it down. I can take care of it better than you can." I stood there, stunned. I stared at the boy I'd once rocked to sleep, the child who used to call me his best friend, and all I saw was a stranger, one with hunger in his eyes, the kind that devours love and leaves only entitlement behind. I asked him why he was in such a rush, and he scoffed. "Because if you don't give it to me now, someone else might try to get their hands on it, like that neighbor of yours. Don't think I don't see what's going on." I didn't even know what he meant, but the venom in his tone made my stomach twist. He wasn't just asking for the farm, he was accusing me of betrayal, somehow. After he left that day, the house felt heavier than it ever had before. I walked through each room, touching the walls Harold and I had built, feeling the life we'd made together echo around me. I realized something then, something I hadn't wanted to admit. Jake didn't love the farm. He loved what it could give him. And maybe, just maybe, that meant he didn't deserve it at all. That was the moment I realized maybe Jake didn't deserve the legacy he was so desperate to claim. Jake's tone had changed from pleading to entitled, and that's when the first cracks began to show. It started with small things. The way he would sigh when I didn't agree with him, or how he'd roll his eyes whenever I mentioned Harold's old ways of doing things. He stopped pretending to care about the sentimental parts of the farm, the stories, the traditions, the family memories. To him, everything was about profit. One morning, he showed up again, holding a folder under his arm and an arrogant smirk on his face. "I've been looking into ways to modernize the place," he said, without even saying hello. He spread papers across the kitchen table, blueprints, maps, projections. We could section off a few acres and lease them. Maybe add a couple of rental cabins. Easy money. I stared at the papers in silence. I didn't recognize my own grandson anymore. "Jake," I said softly, "this isn't a business project. It's home." He leaned back in his chair, scoffing. "Home? Grandma, this place is worth more than you think. You're sitting on an opportunity and wasting it. Times have changed. You can't live off old-fashioned ideas forever." His words hit me harder than he could have imagined. Harold and I had built everything here with our hands we'd spent decades planting, repairing, and preserving. And now my own flesh and blood was calling it a waste. I tried to stay calm. "You talk like this farm is just dirt and numbers," I told him. "But it's not. Every inch of it has meaning." Jake gave me that patronizing half-smile he'd started wearing lately. "Meaning doesn't pay the bills, Grandma." Then, as if to add insult to injury, he added, "You've done enough. Maybe it's time someone else took over." I wanted to tell him that I wasn't ready to hand anything over, but something told me it wouldn't matter. He'd already made up his mind about what he thought he deserved. That afternoon, after Jake left, Ellen stopped by with a loaf of freshly baked bread. She'd seen his car speeding away and asked if everything was all right. I smiled weakly and told her it was fine, even though it wasn't. She looked at me the way a friend does when they already know you're lying. She changed the subject, telling me about her plans to expand her small rescue shelter. "I found 2 more strays on the road," she said, laughing softly. "Poor things looked like they hadn't eaten in days. I can't say no to those eyes." There was something about her kindness that always seemed to bring me peace. We sat on the porch, watching the sunset stain the sky with gold and pink. She talked about wanting to make her land a safe place for animals, not for money, not for gain, but because it mattered. And sitting beside her, I felt more at home than I had in weeks. Later that evening, Jake called. I didn't want to answer, but I did. His tone was sharp. "You're spending a lot of time with that neighbor," he said. "What's she after?" "Ellen?" I asked, confused. "She's just a friend." "Yeah, right," he said bitterly. "She's playing you. People like her don't just show up for no reason." I told him to stop talking like that Ellen had done nothing but show kindness. But he wouldn't listen. "You don't know her, Grandma. She's not from here. She doesn't belong." His words made me uneasy. There was an anger in him I didn't recognize. I asked, "Jake, why do you hate her so much?" He paused. I could almost hear him grinding his teeth through the phone. "Because she's bad news," he finally said. "She's ruining the property value around here. She doesn't know how things work." Something about the way he said property value made my stomach turn. It wasn't about Ellen at all, it was about the land again. Always the land. After I hung up, I couldn't stop replaying his words in my mind. I sat by the window, watching the stars come out, and I thought about the boy who used to sit on that same porch swing, asking me to tell him stories about the farm. Back then, his eyes would light up with wonder. Now they burned with greed. A few days later, I ran into Ellen at the market. She asked if Jake was doing all right, and I hesitated before answering. "He's passionate," I said, trying to sound diplomatic. She smiled kindly, as if she already understood more than I was saying. As we chatted, I realized that the way she spoke about life, about nature, about kindness was everything I had tried to teach Jake. Only she had listened, and he had not. That evening, Jake came over again. He didn't bother with small talk. "You need to stop talking to that woman," he snapped. "She's a problem." I told him that Ellen was no one's problem, that she was a good neighbor. He laughed bitterly. "Good? She's the reason no one wants to invest around here. She's dragging this place down. She's the reason the farm's value is dropping." I froze. "What do you mean?" I asked. He looked away, muttering something under his breath about real estate circles and market interference. None of it made sense. But one thing was clear, he knew more about Ellen's past than he was willing to admit. As he left, I stood on the porch. the cold wind cutting through my sweater. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something bigger behind his anger, something he hadn't told me. When he called her the reason the farm's value is dropping, I realized there was a truth he wasn't telling me. The next person to corner me about the farm wasn't Jake, it was my daughter, Nora. It was a Tuesday evening when she called out of the blue and asked if she could come over for dinner. I hadn't seen her in a while, and something in her voice told me this wasn't just a casual visit. I spent the afternoon making her favorite meal, roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and my homemade gravy, hoping we could have a peaceful evening like we used to. When she arrived, she gave me a hug, but it felt rehearsed, as if she was doing it because she thought she should, not because she wanted to. She kept glancing at her phone throughout dinner, barely touching her food. Finally, she cleared her throat and said, "Mom, can we talk about something important?" I knew right then what something important meant. She folded her hands on the table and said, "Jake's been worried about you. He says you've been acting strange lately. That you've been distant." Distant, I repeated, trying to keep my voice calm. "I've just been keeping to myself, that's all." She nodded slowly, but I could tell she didn't believe me. "He mentioned you've been spending a lot of time with that neighbor woman. Ellen, right?" I set down my fork. "Ellen's a good friend. What about her?" Nora hesitated. "Jake just thinks maybe she's trying to take advantage of you. You have to admit, Mom, it's a little odd that she showed up out of nowhere and suddenly she's always around." I stared at my daughter, realizing the words sounded familiar because they were the same ones Jake had said. "He's been talking to you about this, hasn't he?" I asked quietly. She sighed. "He's worried, that's all. You're not getting any younger, and the farm needs someone who can handle it. He just wants to make sure it stays in the family." I laughed softly, though it came out more like a sigh. "In the family," I repeated. "That's funny. I thought family was supposed to care about me, not just what I own." Nora frowned. "That's not fair, Mom. Jake loves you. We both do. We just don't want to see things get complicated." But I could hear it in her tone, the nervousness, the guilt. Jake had been putting pressure on her too. He was using her as the messenger because he knew I might still listen to her. I took a deep breath. "Nora, do you remember what your father always said about this farm?" She shook her head. "He said a lot of things. He said land is a living thing. It needs care, patience, and love. You can't buy that and you can't demand it." She looked down at her plate, her expression softening just a little. "Mom, I'm not saying Jake's right. I just think you should be practical. If you don't make a plan now, people will fight over it later. I don't want that for our family." Her voice cracked on the word family, and for a brief second, I saw the little girl she used to be, the one who'd run barefoot through these fields, chasing butterflies and laughing until her sides hurt. But then her eyes hardened again, and that softness disappeared. "I'll handle things when I'm ready," I said firmly. "Mom," she said, her tone shifting, "you'll regret it if you don't plan ahead. Jake's just trying to help." "Help?" I repeated, my voice rising before I could stop it. "By demanding what isn't his? By talking to realtors behind my back? That's not help, Nora. That's greed." Her eyes widened. "He talked to a realtor?" I instantly regretted saying it. I hadn't meant to let that slip, but it was too late. Her fork clattered against her plate. "What are you talking about?" I looked away. "It doesn't matter. I've already handled it." But of course, it did matter. Nora pressed me for details, but I refused to say more. The tension hung heavy between us, thicker than the steam rising from the food we'd forgotten to eat. When she finally stood to leave, she looked at me like she didn't know who I was anymore. "I just don't want this family torn apart over a piece of land," she said. I wanted to tell her that it wasn't the land tearing us apart, it was the greed attached to it. But I stayed quiet. Sometimes silence speaks louder than words. After she drove away, I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the dishes we hadn't touched. The clock ticked louder than usual, marking the seconds of a night that felt like the end of something. The next morning, I found myself walking the perimeter of the farm. The air was cool, the grass still wet with dew. I looked at the rows of crops, the old barn leaning slightly to one side, the swing Harold had built for Nora when she was a child. Everything about this place whispered memories, promises, and pain. I realized that the people I thought would protect this land were the ones who wanted to use it. And the people who had no claim to it, like Ellen, were the ones who respected it. Later that week, I got a strange call from the local real estate office. The woman on the phone asked if I was still interested in listing my property for future valuation. I froze. I never contacted you, I said. Oh, she replied awkwardly. Then perhaps it was a relative? The gentleman mentioned he was speaking on behalf of his grandmother. My heart sank. I didn't need to ask who it was. I thanked her politely, hung up the phone, and stood in silence for a long moment, gripping the edge of the counter until my knuckles turned white. I walked to the window, staring out at the land that had carried generations of my family, and for the first time, I felt a coldness creep through my chest. It wasn't just betrayal, it was realization. That night, I found out Jake had already called a realtor about future listings. Curiosity led me to make a phone call that shattered everything I thought I knew about my grandson. For days after that conversation with the real estate office, I couldn't think straight. My mind kept replaying the woman's words. The gentleman mentioned he was speaking on behalf of his grandmother. The more I turned it over in my head, the more it ate away at me. Jake wasn't just impatient, he was making plans. Behind my back, using my name. I needed to know the truth. So, one morning, after barely sleeping through the night, I picked up the phone and called that same real estate office again. My hands trembled slightly as I held the receiver, my heart pounding against my ribs like it was trying to warn me. A young man answered cheerfully. "Good morning, Campbell Realty. How can I help you?" I cleared my throat. "I'm calling about a property inquiry on County Road 16. I believe my grandson may have spoken to someone there recently." The man paused. "Let me check our notes." The silence on the other end felt like an eternity. I stared out the kitchen window at the fields glowing under the morning sun, wishing for once that ignorance could be a comfort I could return to. When the voice came back, it was casual, unaware of the bomb it was about to drop. "Yes, ma'am, we did speak to a Jake Patterson. He said he was representing his grandmother, Ruth Patterson, about potential future listings. He was asking about market values, zoning options, and subdivision possibilities." Subdivision possibilities. My whole body went cold. Did he say I asked him to do that?" I whispered. "I'm not sure, ma'am. He said it was something you were considering but hadn't finalized." I thanked him, hung up, and just stood there, the phone still pressed to my ear long after the line went dead. That was it. Proof. Jake wasn't waiting for me to hand him the farm, he was already acting like it was his. For the first time in my life, my hands shook from anger, not age. I called Jake immediately. When he picked up, his voice was smooth, practiced, like he'd already prepared a story. "Hey, Grandma," he said. "What's up?" "I just got off the phone with Campbell Realty," I said. "Care to explain why they think you're the owner of my farm?" There was a pause. Then, with false innocence, he replied, "What? I didn't say I owned it. I just asked for some information. It's not a big deal." "Not a big deal?" My voice cracked with disbelief. "You're making calls pretending to represent me, and that's not a big deal?" He sighed, irritated. "Grandma, calm down. I was just checking the market. It's called being proactive. You should be thanking me." "Thanking you?" I snapped. "For lying? For using my name? For planning to sell something that doesn't belong to you?" His tone shifted, then sharp, cold, almost mocking. "You're overreacting. You don't understand how things work now. I'm trying to protect what's ours." "What's ours?" I repeated, my throat tightening. "Jake, this farm isn't yours." He went silent. Then, in a voice so quiet it sent a chill through me, he said, "Not yet." The line went dead. I stood there in my kitchen, feeling smaller than I had in years. The wind outside rattled the window panes, and for a moment, I thought I heard Harold's voice in my head, that steady, calm tone he used whenever life got hard. "Stand your ground, Ruth. Don't let them take what's yours." I sank into the old wooden chair at the table and just stared at the floor. I had given everything to this family, every ounce of love, every bit of time, and this was how they repaid me. That afternoon, Ellen came by with a basket of vegetables from her garden. I must have looked terrible, because she didn't even make it to the porch before she asked, "Ruth, what happened?" I told her everything. The phone call, the realtor, the lies. She listened silently, her face unreadable, until I finished. Then she put the basket down and looked me straight in the eye. "You can't let him get away with that," she said firmly. "You need to make sure your name stays where it belongs, on your own land." "I just don't understand how he could do this to me," I said, my voice breaking. "He's my grandson, Ellen. I raised him. I taught him everything he knows about this place. Ellen reached across the table and gently covered my hand with hers. Sometimes blood doesn't mean loyalty, she said softly. Sometimes it's the people who show up when you need them that really care. Her words struck deep. There was no judgment in her tone, no pity, just truth. I had always believed that family was sacred, that no matter what happened, they'd stand by you. But now, I wasn't so sure. Ellen stayed for a while, helping me calm down. We walked through the garden, her presence steady and reassuring. You've worked too hard to let someone else take this from you, she said. Don't make decisions out of guilt. Make them out of strength. I didn't answer right away. My heart was torn between the love of a grandmother and the wisdom of a woman who'd lived long enough to see how love can be twisted. That night, I sat at the kitchen table again, looking through the family photo albums. There was Jake as a boy, sitting on Harold's shoulders, grinning from ear to ear. The sight of it made my chest ache. How had that boy become this man? How had the joy turned into greed? I wanted to believe there was still some good in him, some small part that remembered who he used to be. But as the hours passed, I realized something painful. Even if that part of him still existed, it wasn't enough to undo what he'd done. Ellen looked me in the eye and said, Ruth, maybe it's time you stop letting people like him decide what you're worth. For the first time, Ellen opened up about why Jake hated her, and the truth stunned me. The morning after that awful phone call, I found myself sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the fog roll over the fields. The air was crisp, cool enough to make my fingers ache slightly as I held the mug. I heard the hum of Ellen's truck pulling up the gravel road, and I knew she was coming over before I even saw her. She always did that, appeared exactly when I needed someone to talk to, even if I didn't admit it out loud. She parked beside the barn and waved, her face framed by a tangle of auburn hair that the wind seemed to adore. You look like you've seen a ghost, she said, climbing the porch steps. Something like that, I muttered. Come sit. She joined me, setting down a small basket of eggs from her hens. You didn't sleep much last night, did you? I shook my head. No. Couldn't stop thinking about everything. About Jake. She was quiet for a moment before she said softly, He doesn't like me much, does he? I almost laughed at the understatement. That's putting it mildly. He seems to think you're the root of all evil. Her lips pressed into a small, sad smile. I figured as much. She looked out over the fields, her eyes far away. There's something you should probably know, Ruth. It might explain why he feels that way. I turned toward her, surprised. Go on. She hesitated, as if weighing whether to tell me. Then she took a deep breath. About 8 years ago, before I bought this property, my late husband, Thomas, got into a legal dispute with a development company. They were trying to buy up farmland in the next county, offering families quick money to sell. Thomas refused. He wanted to protect the local wetlands. It turned into a lawsuit. I nodded, remembering hearing about that in the papers years ago. I do recall something like that, I said. It dragged on for months. Ellen nodded. It did. And that company lost a lot of money because of it. Your grandson, Jake, he worked for them. Fresh out of college, he was part of their acquisition team. My heart gave a slow, heavy thud. You're saying Jake was involved in that case? She nodded. Not directly in the legal sense, but enough that when the lawsuit was settled, he was one of the people let go. Thomas used to feel terrible about it, even though we were just trying to do what was right. But I guess for Jake, I became the enemy. I sat back, trying to take it all in. The puzzle pieces began fitting together: his hatred, his suspicion, his obsession with money and property. To him, Ellen wasn't just a neighbor. She was the face of a loss he never got over. Good Lord, I whispered. He's been carrying that grudge all this time. Ellen shrugged lightly, but there was sorrow in her eyes. It's strange how some people hold on to anger like it's the only thing keeping them alive. I stared out across the fields, the silence between us heavy with understanding. And to think, I thought he just didn't like you because of where you came from. She gave a small, sad laugh. Maybe it's both, but it doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that you see him clearly now. Her words stung, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. I had spent months trying to justify his behavior, convincing myself he was just stressed, or young, or misunderstood. But now, I couldn't deny it any longer. Jake's anger wasn't about me. It was about his pride. Ellen poured us both more coffee, her movements gentle and precise. You know, Ruth, she said quietly. Sometimes family isn't who we share blood with. It's who shares the burden when life gets hard. I looked at her, realizing how much she'd done for me in such a short time. She'd fixed fences with me, brought food when I was too tired to cook, and never once asked for anything in return. Meanwhile, my own grandson was plotting behind my back. That's a nice thought, I said. But it's sad that it feels so rare. She smiled faintly. Rare things are worth protecting. We sat together for a long time, saying nothing. The wind rustled through the cornstalks, and the sound reminded me of Harold's laugh, steady, strong, comforting. I wondered what he'd say if he were still alive. I knew he'd tell me to stop doubting myself, to do what was right, not what was easy. That evening, I pulled out the old family photo albums again. I looked at Jake as a child, holding his first fishing rod, mud on his boots, sunlight on his hair. Then I turned the page and saw a picture of Harold and me standing in front of the house when it was newly built. Two people who had built a life from the ground up, with nothing but love and hard work. I ran my fingers over the photo and whispered, "What would you do, Harold?" The answer, or maybe the memory of one, came easily. I'd protect what we built, even if it means letting it go. Later that night, I called Ellen. She answered on the first ring. "You still awake?" she asked. "Barely," I said. "But I can't stop thinking about what you told me. About Jake. About everything." "Then don't just think about it," she said gently. "Do something about it. Decide what you want your legacy to be, and who deserves to carry it." Her voice was calm, almost soothing, but it planted something deep inside me. For the first time, I began to imagine what life could look like if I stopped living for the expectations of others, if I stopped trying to please people who only saw me as a stepping stone. That night, as I lay in bed, I stared up at the ceiling and listened to the wind creak through the rafters. The farm had always been a symbol of love and continuity for me, but maybe it was time for it to become something else, a symbol of choice. And that thought planted a seed I didn't expect to grow. The day Jake came storming into the house uninvited was the day I stopped seeing him as my sweet grandson. It was early afternoon, and I was in the kitchen kneading dough for bread when I heard the sound of tires skidding on gravel. I looked out the window and saw Jake's truck racing up the driveway like a bullet. My stomach tightened instantly. I didn't even have to guess why he was here. He didn't bother knocking. The screen door slammed open, hitting the wall behind it. He barked, his voice sharp and angry. I wiped my hands on a towel and turned to face him. "Jake, what on earth are you doing? You scared me half to death." He didn't apologize. He just stormed toward the table and threw a stack of papers down in front of me. "This has gone on long enough," he said. "I'm done waiting." I stared at the papers, printed contracts, legal documents, something that looked like an agreement form. "What is this?" I asked, my voice quiet but firm. He crossed his arms. "A joint ownership proposal. I had a lawyer draft it. If you sign this, the farm will be co-owned between you and me. You'll still live here, but I'll have rights to manage and sell parts of it. It's a win-win." A win-win. The arrogance in those words made my blood boil. "And you thought you could just walk in here and tell me to sign over half of everything your grandfather and I worked for?" He exhaled loudly, as though I were the one being unreasonable. "Grandma, come on. I'm trying to help you. You're getting older, and you can't take care of this place forever. I'm the next in line. It's only fair." "Fair?" I repeated. "Do you think it's fair to lie to me? To call realtors pretending to represent me? To treat me like a burden just because I'm not giving you what you want?" He looked away for a second, his jaw tightening. "You talked to them," he muttered. "Figures." Then his tone hardened. "That was just business. You're making this personal." "It is personal," I shouted. "This isn't some property deal, Jake. This is my life, my home. Your grandfather built this with his bare hands." He leaned forward, slamming his palms on the table. "And look at it now, Grandma. It's falling apart. The barn needs repairs, half the fencing's rotted, and the crops don't bring in anything close to what they used to. You can't keep pretending this place is still what it was 50 years ago." His words cut deep because there was truth in them, but truth without love is cruelty, and that's what I saw in his eyes. Cruelty. "I'm not pretending," I said quietly. "I'm surviving." Jake shook his head, pacing the kitchen. "You're being manipulated. You know that? That woman next door, she's using you. She's just waiting for you to keel over so she can swoop in and take this place." My breath caught. "Ellen? That's what this is about?" He turned, his eyes blazing. She's poison, Grandma. Everyone in town knows she's trouble. You think she's your friend, but she's after your land. People like her always are. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. Ellen has been nothing but kind to me. She helps me. She listens. She's done more for me in 1 year than you have in the last 5. He froze. That's not true. It is, I said softly. And you know it. For a moment, there was silence, a thick, suffocating silence that filled the entire kitchen. Then Jake's face twisted with anger. You're choosing her over your own family? I'm choosing peace, I replied. Something I haven't had since you started treating me like a signature instead of a grandmother. He stared at me like he couldn't comprehend the words. Then he laughed a sharp, bitter sound. You're making a huge mistake, he said. When the time comes, you'll wish you'd handled this differently. Maybe, I said, but at least the choice will be mine. He picked up the papers and shoved them back into his bag. Fine. Don't say I didn't try, but don't come crying to me when she takes you for everything you've got. Jake, I said quietly as he turned toward the door. This isn't about Ellen. You've changed, and I don't even recognize who you are anymore. He didn't respond. He slammed the screen door behind him and stomped across the porch. The sound of his truck engine roared to life, and within seconds, he was gone, leaving nothing behind but the faint smell of exhaust and the echo of his anger. I stood there for a long time, listening to the stillness settle back over the house. My hands were trembling, but I wasn't sure if it was from fear or from something else resolve. For the first time, I saw Jake clearly, not as the boy I'd raised, but as the man he'd become. A man who saw love as leverage and kindness as weakness. Later that evening, Ellen stopped by, unaware of what had just happened. She found me sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the horizon. You all right? She asked. I nodded slowly. I will be. She sat beside me, not saying a word. The sun was setting behind the hills, bathing everything in gold. I could hear the soft rustle of the corn, the distant call of a hawk, and beneath it all, a quiet strength rising in my chest. Something inside me had broken that day, but something else had awakened too. I realized I had spent too long letting guilt control my choices. Too long letting Jake's anger dictate what I did or didn't do. That was over now. I wasn't just a grandmother anymore. I was a woman who had built a life, and I wasn't going to let anyone, not even my own blood, take it away from me. But I knew in that moment he would be the one regretting it soon. I decided to teach Jake a lesson he would never forget. That night, after Jake's truck disappeared down the road, I sat alone at the kitchen table with nothing but the ticking of the clock and the hum of the refrigerator for company. The bread I'd been baking earlier had gone cold on the counter, untouched. I wasn't hungry. I was angry in a way I hadn't felt in years. But underneath that anger was something stronger, clarity. For months, I'd been letting guilt steer my decisions. I'd been afraid of confrontation, afraid of losing the people I loved. But sitting there in the quiet, I realized something important sometimes. Love has to stop protecting and start correcting. I pulled my old journal from the drawer. It was a habit Harold had taught me years ago: when you're lost, write it down. So I did. I listed every moment Jake had tried to manipulate me, every cruel word he'd thrown my way, every time he'd turned love into leverage. When I finished, the page looked like a map of betrayal. And as I looked at that list, an idea began to take root. I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't even going to argue. I was going to make a choice that spoke louder than any words could. The next morning, I called my lawyer, Mr. Henley, a man in his 70s who'd handled our family's affairs for decades. He'd known Harold well and had always treated me with the utmost respect. When he answered, his voice was warm and calm, like always. Ruth, it's been a while. How are you holding up? I've been better, I admitted. I need to make some changes, Mr. Henley. Regarding the farm. There was a pause on the other end. Changes? He repeated carefully. Yes, I want to update my will. Immediately. All right, he said slowly. And who are we transferring it to? I hesitated, feeling the weight of the decision pressing against my chest. Then I said it. To my neighbor, Ellen Hayes. There was a silence so long I thought the line had gone dead. Finally, he said, That's unexpected. I know, I said quietly. But she's the only one who's been here for me. The only one who cares about this land for the right reasons. I don't need to tell you that your family might contest this, he warned gently. They can try, I replied. But I want it to be airtight. His tone softened. I've never been surer of anything in my life. We scheduled an appointment for the following Monday. After I hung up, I sat there in silence, my heart pounding, my hands trembling, not with fear this time, but with power. For the first time in a long time, I was taking control. Later that day, I invited Ellen over for tea. She came in smiling as usual, her hair pulled into a messy bun, a smudge of dirt on her cheek from working with her animals. "You've been busy," she said when she saw the papers scattered across my table. "I suppose you could say that," I said with a small smile. "Ellen, can I ask you something? What would you do if you suddenly had a big piece of land? This land, for instance?" She blinked, clearly caught off guard. "This land? Well, I'd take care of it. I'd preserve it. Maybe turn part of it into a sanctuary for the animals." "Why do you ask?" I studied her face carefully. There wasn't a flicker of greed or calculation, just sincerity. "I was just curious," I said softly. "It's good to know." She gave me a puzzled look but didn't press further. Instead, she started talking about the new shelter pens she was building and how excited she was for spring. I let her talk, all the while feeling a growing certainty inside me. Ellen loved the land, truly loved it. She didn't see it as a way to make money, she saw it as something alive, something worth nurturing. When she left that afternoon, she hugged me tightly and said, "You're stronger than you think, Ruth." Those words echoed in my head long after she drove away. That night, I gathered all the old deeds, financial documents, and photos that tied me to the farm. I laid them out across the table, each one representing a piece of my life. Harold's handwriting on the original property documents, the photo of Nora's first birthday in front of the barn, Jake's muddy footprints across the porch. They were pieces of my history, but I realized that history doesn't have to be preserved in blood. It can live on through choice. When Monday came, I drove into town to meet with Mr. Henley. The office smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. He had everything prepared. As promised, he read the documents carefully, explaining each clause in detail. The new deed would transfer full ownership of the property to Ellen upon my death. With one important condition: I retained lifetime rights to live there, to make every decision until my last day. It was, as he put it, ironclad. He handed me the pen, and for a moment, I just stared at it. Signing meant closing one chapter and beginning another. I thought about Jake's face, his fury, his disbelief when he'd find out. But then I thought of Ellen's kindness, her laughter, her respect for the land and for me. I signed. When I was done, Mr. Henley smiled faintly. "You look lighter," he said. "I think I am," I replied. "For the first time in years." He nodded. "Right choice." I left the office feeling a strange calm settle over me. The sky was a soft blue, the air cool but comforting. I drove home with the windows down, letting the wind whip through my hair. The fields stretched out before me, golden and alive, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like they were truly mine again, not because of a document or a name, but because I had finally taken back control of what mattered. When I pulled into the driveway, I parked the car and looked out toward Ellen's property. I could see her feeding her goats, her laughter, floating faintly through the air. I smiled, but I didn't tell anyone, not yet. Especially not Jake. The weeks that followed were eerily quiet, too quiet. After signing the papers, something inside me settled, as if the constant storm that had been swirling in my chest finally blew itself out. The farm felt different, lighter somehow. I moved through my days with a calm sense of purpose, tending the garden, feeding the chickens, mending fences that had been ignored for too long. The rhythm of the land soothed me, grounding me in a way that no amount of family reconciliation ever could. For a few blessed weeks, there was peace. Jake didn't call, didn't visit, didn't text. It was as if he had disappeared altogether. At first, I was relieved. Then, as days turned into weeks, that relief gave way to unease. Silence from Jake was never just silence, it was the quiet before another storm. Ellen noticed it too. She came by most afternoons, bringing her usual good spirits and a basket of something fresh: strawberries, zucchini, sometimes even a pie. She never asked directly about Jake, but she could read the worry on my face. One day, as we sat on the porch sipping iced tea, she said, "You know, sometimes distance can be a blessing. even when it feels strange. I smiled faintly. I keep waiting for the phone to ring, I admitted. It's almost worse not hearing from him. At least, when he's angry, I know where I stand. Ellen looked out at the horizon, the wind brushing strands of hair across her cheek. Maybe he's realizing he can't control you anymore, she said. That's not something people like him take lightly. Her words stuck with me. Maybe Jake was licking his wounds, recalculating. Or maybe he was simply waiting for the right time to strike again. Still, for a while, life was peaceful. I poured myself into small joys, planting late-season flowers, repainting the shutters Harold had built decades ago, fixing up the front porch swing where he and I had spent countless evenings watching fireflies. There was something healing about doing those simple tasks, like reclaiming pieces of my life one nail and brushstroke at a time. Some evenings Ellen would stay for dinner, and we'd talk for hours. She told me about the new rescues she'd taken in 2 kittens and an old beagle that had been abandoned near the highway. She had a soft heart for creatures most people overlooked. I guess I see myself in them, she'd say with a smile. I laughed. That makes 2 of us. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low and turned the fields a deep amber, I sat alone on the porch swing with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. I listened to the crickets and the distant bleating of Ellen's goats. For the first time in years, I felt content. The air smelled of fresh hay and peace. But peace, I've learned, rarely lasts long in a family like mine. It was a Saturday morning when I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. My heart skipped. I hadn't invited anyone, and Ellen always called before she came over. I stepped outside, shielding my eyes from the sunlight, and there it was. Jake's car. My breath caught in my throat. He got out slowly this time. No slamming doors or stomping feet. He was dressed neatly, his hair combed back, his shirt tucked in. The change in his demeanor was unsettling. His smile, when he saw me, looked almost genuine, but I'd learned by now not to trust smiles that didn't reach the eyes. "Grandma," he said, walking up the steps. "You look good." I narrowed my eyes slightly. "That's new," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. He chuckled lightly, as if we were sharing a private joke. "I know. I haven't been around much. I've been thinking, maybe we got off on the wrong foot." "Maybe?" I said quietly. He ignored my tone and continued. "I don't want us to fight anymore. I just want to make things right." I wanted to believe him, oh, how I wanted to. A part of me still saw that little boy who used to bring me dandelions and call them flowers. I studied his face, looking for sincerity, for some trace of the grandson I'd loved so deeply. But there was something in his eyes, something too controlled, too practiced. I stepped aside anyway and gestured toward the kitchen. "All right," I said. "Come in." Inside, the air felt tight, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Jake moved with a casual confidence that made me uneasy. He sat down at the kitchen table like he owned it. "Coffee?" I asked, more out of habit than hospitality. He nodded. "Sure. Black." While I poured his cup, he opened the briefcase he'd been carrying. I froze, mid-motion. That briefcase wasn't just for show. Jake didn't do anything without a purpose. He pulled out a few neatly stacked papers, the kind that always spelled trouble. "I brought something for you to look over," he said casually. "Just some options, you know, for the future." My voice came out thin. "Options?" "Yeah," he said, flipping through the pages. "I figured you'd want to make things official. I talked to a few people, lawyers, investors, and I think I've come up with a fair solution for both of us." Every word he said made my skin crawl. He had that smooth, salesman tone again, the one that tried to sound reasonable while hiding a knife behind his back. I sat down across from him, folding my hands. "Jake, what exactly are you proposing?" He smiled faintly, like he'd rehearsed this moment. "Let's just say, we both get what we want." I didn't answer right away. I watched him, really watched him, and I saw the truth. His voice might have softened, his words might have sounded gentle, but his eyes were still sharp and hungry. A familiar ache tightened in my chest. This wasn't a reconciliation, it was a performance. "Jake," I said slowly, "why don't you tell me what's really in that briefcase?" He looked up at me, and for a split second, that fake smile faltered. Then he forced it back. "Just some paperwork," he said lightly. "Nothing you need to worry about." But I was already worrying. I could feel it deep in my gut. The storm wasn't over. It was just waiting for the right moment to break. Then I noticed the briefcase in his hand and my gut told me he wasn't here for peace. Jake's smile was the fakest thing I'd ever seen. He sat there at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd taught him to tie his shoes and eat his first slice of pie, now spread with contracts in fine print. The morning light filtered through the window, landing on his face, and for a second, I could see the boy he used to be, but then he spoke, and that image shattered. "Grandma," he said smoothly, "this doesn't have to be complicated. I just want what's fair." I leaned against the counter, my arms crossed. "You keep using that word, Jake, fair. I don't think it means what you think it means." He smirked, like he was humoring a child. "You've been manipulated, Grandma. Everyone in town knows it. That neighbor of yours, she's clever. I'll give her that. She's got you wrapped around her finger." "Stop," I said sharply. But he didn't. He kept going, the words dripping with disdain. "I'm not judging you. You're lonely. You just needed someone to talk to." She saw that and took advantage of it. People like her always do. "Enough." He finally looked up at me then, his expression cool and detached. "You think I don't know what's going on? You think I haven't heard the rumors?" "What rumors?" I asked, even though I already knew he was twisting something into a weapon. "That she's getting close to you because of the land," he said. "That she's waiting for you to—" "Don't you dare finish that sentence," I said, my voice rising. "Ellen's done nothing but help me. If you spent half as much time caring as she does, we wouldn't be standing here." He leaned back, sighing dramatically. "You really can't see it, can you? She's not your friend. She's after the same thing I am, the farm. Only difference is, she's smarter about it." I stared at him, speechless for a moment. "You really think everyone's as greedy as you are, don't you?" He tilted his head. "I'm realistic." "No," I said quietly. "You're heartless." That wiped the smirk off his face. For a moment, the mask slipped, and I saw something raw beneath it, anger, resentment, maybe even guilt, but it disappeared as quickly as it came. He straightened the papers in front of him. "Look, I'm not here to fight. I'm here to solve this before things get messy. I had these drawn up. They'll transfer limited rights to me, management rights, mostly. You'll still live here, you'll still make day-to-day decisions, but I'll have the authority to handle the business side of things." I didn't move. I just looked at him, the way you look at a stranger who's pretending to know you. "Why would I ever sign that?" "Because if you don't," he said calmly, "you'll make things harder for everyone. For you, for Mom, for me." He said it like a threat, wrapped in concern. I walked over and picked up one of the papers, skimming the dense paragraphs of legal jargon. It didn't take long to see the truth. This wasn't a partnership agreement. It was a transfer of control, disguised with clever wording. Once I signed, he'd have power to sell, mortgage, or lease parts of the farm as he pleased. My throat tightened. "You actually thought I'd fall for this?" His expression hardened. "You think I'd go through all this trouble if I didn't believe you needed help?" "I don't need help, Jake," I said, my voice trembling not from fear, but from fury. "I need honesty, and you don't have that to give." He stood then, pushing his chair back so abruptly it screeched against the floor. "You're making a mistake. You can't keep this place forever. You'll end up leaving a mess for us to clean up." "Us?" I asked coldly. "You mean you?" He clenched his fists, his face reddening. "I'm the only one thinking about the future here." "The future?" I snapped. "You mean your bank account. You're not thinking about me or the farm. You're thinking about money. That's all you've ever cared about." He looked at me for a long time, his jaw tight. Then he said, "You'll regret saying that." "No, Jake," I said quietly. "You'll regret everything you've done." The silence that followed was heavy and sharp. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. "Finally," he muttered. "You're too old to understand how the world works now." I smiled sadly. "And you're too young to understand what truly matters." He scooped up his papers and shoved them back into his briefcase. "You're making a fool of yourself," he said. "You think that woman next door cares about you? She's laughing at you behind your back." "Enough, Jake." My voice cracked through the air like a whip. "You've said enough." He froze in the doorway, one hand on the frame, the other gripping the handle of his briefcase so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Grandma," he said finally, without turning around. "You'll be sorry when the truth comes out." I stood perfectly still. My voice was low, steady, and certain. "No, Jake. You already lost the truth when you stopped being honest with yourself." He stormed out, slamming the door behind him so hard that the glass rattled in its frame. I stood there for a long moment, breathing slowly, letting the echo fade. Then I walked to the window and watched as his car tore down the driveway, kicking up dust in its wake. My hands trembled slightly, but I didn't feel fear. I felt something else resolve. For years, I'd been holding on to the hope that Jake would change, that the boy who once helped me plant tomatoes and chase the dog through the fields would somehow come back. But that boy was gone. The man who replaced him only cared about control, and I wasn't going to give him any. That night, I sat by the fire, watching the flames flicker and curl, and I made myself a promise. I would not be bullied, guilted, or manipulated again. The papers he'd brought were still on the table, and I stared at them until the words blurred together. Then, one by one, I fed them into the fire. The edges curled, blackened, and turned to ash. I watched the smoke drift upward, disappearing into nothing, and felt a quiet, steady satisfaction take its place. The fight wasn't over, I knew that much. Jake wouldn't walk away quietly. But for the first time in months, maybe years, I wasn't afraid of what came next. He stormed out yelling, "You'll be sorry when the truth comes out." The next morning, I called my lawyer to finalize everything, and the relief was indescribable. I didn't sleep much that night after Jake stormed out. His words had lingered like smoke, bitter and suffocating. I kept seeing his face twisted with anger, hearing his threat echoing in my mind. "You'll be sorry when the truth comes out." But the only truth that mattered to me now was my own. I wasn't going to live in fear anymore. As the sun rose, painting the sky in pale gold, I made a pot of coffee and sat at the table, staring at the phone. Then, without another moment's hesitation, I dialed Mr. Henley's number. "Good morning, Ruth," he said when he answered. His voice was calm, familiar, grounding. "I had a feeling I'd be hearing from you soon." I almost laughed. "You always did have good instincts, Henry. I'm ready. Let's finish what we started." "Of course," he said, the smile evident in his tone. "I'll draw up the final documentation. Once it's signed, it's official, no going back." "I don't want to go back," I told him firmly. "I just want peace." A few hours later, I drove into town. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the smell of hay and chimney smoke. Mr. Henley's office was quiet. The way it always was, sunlight streaming through old lace curtains, dust motes floating like memories in the air. He had everything ready when I walked in. "All that's left is your signature," he said, sliding the papers across the desk. My hand hovered over the pen for a moment. This was the final step, the moment that would sever Jake's imagined claim to my life's work. But more than that, it was my declaration of independence, a quiet rebellion against manipulation. I took a deep breath and signed. When the ink dried, Mr. Henley smiled gently. "There you go, Ruth. The property is now officially in Ellen Hayes's name, with lifetime rights reserved for you. No one can contest this without clear evidence of coercion, which we both know doesn't exist." I nodded, a rush of emotion catching in my throat. "Thank you," I whispered. He leaned back in his chair, studying me. "You did the right thing. People like you build legacies through kindness and strength. It's only fair that it ends up in the hands of someone who understands both." Driving home, I felt lighter than I had in years. The weight that had been pressing on my chest finally lifted. The fields seemed brighter, the air fresher. The farm was safe. I was safe. When I got back, I found Ellen tending to her goats near the fence line. She waved as I pulled up, her usual cheerful smile spreading across her face. I walked toward her, holding the sealed envelope with the final documents in my hand. "I did it," I said simply. Her brow furrowed slightly. "Did what?" "I transferred the farm to you," I said. "It's yours now, legally, officially, completely. I'll live here for the rest of my days, but when I'm gone, it's all yours." Ellen blinked, her mouth opening slightly in shock. "Ruth, what are you talking about? You can't." "I can," I interrupted softly. And I did. She stared at me, shaking her head. "Why would you do that? You have family." I gave a small, sad smile. "Family isn't always who shares your blood, Ellen. Sometimes it's the people who show up when everyone else disappears." Her eyes glistened with tears. "I don't know what to say. Just promise me one thing," I said. "Take care of this place. Love it like Harold and I did." "I promise," she whispered. "I'll take care of it like it was my own mother's land." For a long moment, we just stood there, two women bound not by blood but by shared respect. She hugged me tightly, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. That night, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the sun sink low behind the hills. The sky turned shades of orange and violet, the same colors Harold used to say were God's way of tucking the day into bed. I smiled at the thought. For the first time in years, I didn't dread what tomorrow might bring. The farm was secure, Ellen was its rightful guardian, and Jake no longer had any power over me. I should have known it. I wouldn't stay quiet for long. 2 days later, the peace shattered. It was late morning when I heard the gravel crunch under fast-moving tires. I knew that sound. My stomach dropped even before I saw his car. Jake's truck came to a screeching halt beside the porch, dust flying up around it. He jumped out, gripping an envelope in his hand. I stood up slowly, bracing myself. "Jake," I said evenly, "what brings you here?" He didn't answer at first. He stomped up the steps, his eyes blazing. Then he thrust the envelope toward me. "What is this?" he spat. I looked down at it, the official copy of the property transfer. He must have received the notification from the county office. "You tell me," I said calmly. He tore the envelope open and waved the papers in my face. "You gave it to her? The neighbor? Her?" "Yes," I said simply. "I did." "Why?" His voice cracked between anger and disbelief. "She's not family. You've lost your mind, Grandma. She's using you." I looked him squarely in the eye. "No, Jake, she's helping me. Something you stopped doing a long time ago." He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "You don't get it, do you? You think this is going to make you happy? You think she actually cares? You've ruined everything." I stayed silent. There was nothing left to say. He slammed his hand on the porch railing. "You'll regret this. You hear me?" I met his glare with calm resolve. "No, Jake. You're the one who'll regret it. Because for the first time in my life I chose myself." For a moment, the only sound was his ragged breathing. Then he backed away, his face pale with fury. "You're going to die alone on that stupid farm," he muttered. "And when you do, you'll wish you'd listened to me." He turned, stomped down the steps, and got into his truck. Gravel flew as he sped away, the roar of the engine fading into the distance. I stood there long, after he was gone, the autumn wind wrapping around me like a quiet victory. I wasn't shaken. I wasn't scared. I was free. It didn't take long for the storm to hit. I had known it was coming. I could almost feel it in the air, the way the world goes still before a thunderstorm. Jake wasn't the kind of man to let things go quietly, especially when pride was involved. And what I had done didn't just bruise his ego. It shattered the illusion of control he thought he had over me. 2 days after our confrontation on the porch, I was out by the barn mending a gate when I heard it. The angry roar of Jake's truck coming up the drive. The rumble was so loud that even the chickens scattered in fright. I wiped my hands on my jeans, took a deep breath, and turned toward the noise. Jake's door flew open before the truck had even stopped moving. He jumped out, his face flushed and his jaw tight. He was gripping a thick envelope, the same one from before, only this time it looked crumpled and torn, as if he'd spent the night wringing it in his hands. He stomped up to me, stopping only a few feet away. "What the hell is this, Grandma?" he shouted, waving the papers like a weapon. I stayed calm, my voice steady. "You know exactly what it is. You gave it to her? Her?" His voice cracked. "The neighbor? The woman I told you not to trust?" "Yes," I said quietly. "I did." "Why?" His voice rose with every word. "Why would you do that? Do you have any idea what you've done? This was supposed to stay in the family." I met his anger with silence. Sometimes, silence is the only way to make truth loud enough to hear. He glared at me, waiting for me to break, but I didn't. "Finally," I said, "I did what I thought was right." "What you thought was right," he scoffed. "You just handed our family's legacy over to a stranger." "She's not a stranger, Jake," I replied softly. "She's my friend. She's the only one who's been here when I needed someone." He threw his hands up, laughing bitterly. "Oh, that's rich. You give everything to the woman who's been taking advantage of you. And you leave me your grandson with nothing?" "Nothing?" I repeated. "You think this land owes you something? That I owe you something?" His eyes darkened. "After everything I've done for you? Done for me?" I cut him off. "Jake, the only thing you've done for me in years is cause pain. You didn't visit out of love, you visited out of greed. You didn't ask what I needed, you told me what you wanted." He went silent, his chest heaving. For a moment, I thought I saw guilt flicker across his face, but then the bitterness returned, hardening him again. "You've lost your mind," he said. "You're letting that woman manipulate you." "No, Jake," I said. "I'm letting myself make decisions for once. Something I should have done long ago." He stepped closer, his voice low and venomous. "Do you know what people are saying about you? They think you're senile. They think she's playing you. Maybe I should go to the county and tell them that." I stared at him, unflinching. "Go ahead. You'll find out soon enough that everything's legal and binding. You can't undo it." That stopped him cold. His eyes narrowed. "You've really thought this through, haven't you?" "I had to," I said. "You forced me to." He took a step back, his face contorting with rage. "You'll regret this," he spat. "When you're gone, no one will remember you. She'll sell this land to the highest bidder, and everything you and Grandpa built will be gone." I smiled faintly. "Then that'll be her choice. But at least it'll be her choice, not yours." He shook his head, incredulous. "You're insane," he muttered. "I can't believe you'd betray your own family for some outsider. Family isn't supposed to hurt each other," I said quietly. "You stopped being family the moment you started treating me like a business deal." That made him flinch. Just for a moment, his composure cracked, and I saw something that almost looked like heartbreak. But instead of softening, he turned it into anger again. "Fine," he said, his voice tight. "You made your bed, Grandma. I hope you enjoy lying in it." He turned on his heel and stormed back toward his truck. His boots kicked up dust as he went, his anger trailing behind him like smoke. As he reached his door, I called out, "Jake." He stopped, not turning around. "I still love you," I said quietly. "But love doesn't mean surrender. It means knowing when to stop enabling someone who refuses to change." He froze, his shoulders stiff. Then, without a word, he climbed into his truck, slammed the door, and peeled out of the driveway, leaving tire tracks cutting deep into the dirt. The noise faded until all that was left was the sound of the wind rustling through the corn. I stood there for a long moment, feeling both exhausted and strangely calm. Ellen must have seen his truck leaving because a few minutes later, she came running across the yard, concern etched on her face. "Ruth, are you okay?" I nodded slowly. "I'm fine," I said. "He came!" he yelled. "He left." She frowned. "Do you think he's going to try something?" I shrugged. "He might. But it doesn't matter. It's done now. The farm's yours, and that can't be undone." She reached out and squeezed my hand. "You did the right thing, Ruth." "I know," I said, though the words felt bittersweet. That night, as I sat by the window watching the stars, I thought about Jake. I remembered the little boy who used to fall asleep on my lap while I read him bedtime stories. I wondered when that innocence had turned into ambition and when ambition had become greed. Maybe I had spoiled him. Maybe I had given too much and demanded too little. But I also knew one thing with absolute certainty. I had protected the farm the way it deserved to be protected, with heart, not blood. As I closed the curtains, I whispered softly into the quiet house, "Goodbye, Jake." He left that day, vowing never to speak to me again, and I believed him. For the first time in years, I woke up without fear of being pressured or guilt-tripped. The house was quiet, save for the soft ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains, touching the walls in gentle gold. There was no tension in the air, no footsteps pacing outside, no angry voice calling my name. Just peace, the kind of peace that feels earned. I made myself a cup of coffee and stepped out onto the porch. The air smelled of dew and hay, the fields stretching endlessly before me. I breathed it in, letting it fill my lungs like a promise of new beginnings. For once, I didn't feel like a caretaker or a mediator or a mother trying to hold a family together. I just felt like me, Ruth Patterson, a woman who had fought a quiet war and finally won. In the days that followed, life took on a rhythm again. Ellen and I worked side by side, mending fences, feeding animals, and preparing the soil for the next planting season. There was laughter in the air again, real laughter, the kind that doesn't carry guilt behind it. Sometimes, when we sat on the porch at dusk, Ellen would tell me stories about the animals she'd rescued, the ones that had been left behind, unwanted. She said they always came to her broken, but with time, they healed. I couldn't help but smile when she said that, because in a way, I felt the same. I had been broken too by betrayal, by disappointment, by love that had turned into a weapon, and yet, somehow, I was healing. Word about what I'd done spread through the town faster than I expected. At the grocery store, people whispered. At church, a few gave me sympathetic glances, while others nodded as if in approval. Some called me brave, others called me foolish. But it didn't matter. None of their opinions could touch the peace I'd finally found. One afternoon, as Ellen and I were planting wildflowers along the fence line, she looked over at me and said, "You know, Ruth, I think this place is starting to breathe again." I smiled. So am I. The land did feel alive again. The colors seemed richer, the air warmer. Even the old barn creaked less, as if the farm itself had been holding its breath for too long and was finally exhaling. Of course, there were quiet moments when I thought about Jake. No matter how much anger or disappointment I carried, he was still my grandson. I'd catch myself wondering where he was, what he was doing, whether he'd ever realize what he'd lost. There was no hate in me anymore, just sadness, and a sliver of hope that maybe, someday, he'd grow enough to understand. Nora called once. Her tone was cautious, careful, as if she didn't know which version of her mother she'd find on the other end of the line. "Mom," she said, "Jake told me everything. I don't know what you were thinking." "I was thinking about what's right," I replied. "You gave away the family farm. That land was supposed to stay with us." "It did stay with family," I said quietly. "With the only family who treated it and me with love." She sighed heavily. "You're making a mistake." "I've made plenty of mistakes in my life, Nora," I said. "This isn't one of them." She didn't argue further. She just said, "I hope you know what you're doing," before hanging up. After that, I didn't hear from her again for a long while, and strangely, I didn't feel lonely. There's a kind of loneliness that hurts, and a kind that heals. Mine was the latter, peaceful, reflective, and full of quiet gratitude. A few weeks later, Ellen hosted a small gathering at her property to celebrate the opening of her expanded animal rescue. Children ran through the fields laughing, chasing the goats and petting the rabbits. There was joy everywhere, simple, unfiltered joy. I stood off to the side, watching it all with a smile. Ellen came over and looped her arm through mine. "You look happy," she said. "I am," I replied. I didn't think I'd ever be able to say that again. We walked along the fence line, admiring the wildflowers we'd planted weeks earlier. They had begun to bloom, bright patches of yellow and purple swaying in the gentle breeze. As the sun set, the sky blazed in hues of gold and crimson, and I felt Harold's presence beside me not as a ghost, but as a memory that had come home. I could almost hear his voice saying, "You did the right thing, Ruth." That night, I went to bed with a sense of completion. The farm was safe, the land was alive, and my heart, though scarred, was strong again. The next morning, I walked to the mailbox to collect the day's post. Most of it was the usual bills, a church newsletter, a seed catalog. But among the pile was one envelope that made me stop cold. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. Sharp, slanted, and familiar. It was Jake's. For a moment, I just stood there on the porch, the envelope trembling slightly in my hand. My heart pounded as 1,000 thoughts rushed through me, anger, curiosity, fear, and a strange flicker of hope. After everything that had happened, I wasn't sure I was ready to hear what he had to say. But as I stared down at that envelope, I knew there was no avoiding it. Whatever words were inside, they would be the final chapter of something, whether it was forgiveness, closure, or another wound entirely. Then, one morning, I got a letter in the mail with Jake's handwriting on it. I hesitated before opening the envelope, unsure if I was ready for more pain. I sat at the kitchen table for nearly an hour, the letter resting in front of me like a loaded weapon. The envelope was wrinkled, as though it had been gripped too tightly or tossed around in frustration. My name was written in thick, hurried strokes, not the soft, boyish handwriting I remembered from Jake's childhood thank you notes, but sharp, angry slashes of ink. Part of me wanted to tear it up without reading it. I'd already heard every cruel thing he could say in person. Did I really need to see it in writing? But another part of me needed to know, needed to see, once and for all, what his heart had truly become. So, with a deep breath, I slid a knife under the seal and carefully opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, filled from top to bottom with words that looked like they'd been written in one sitting, rushed, uneven, and heavy. My eyes lingered on the first line for a long moment before I found the courage to keep reading. "Grandma," it began, "I can't believe you actually went through with it." I could almost hear his voice as I read the bitterness, the disbelief. the wounded pride that never seemed to heal. You've betrayed the family. You've betrayed me. After everything we've been through, after all the time I spent helping you on that farm when I was younger, you just gave it all away. To a stranger. To her. You don't even see how badly she's played you. I clenched the letter tighter, feeling my chest tighten. The words cut deep, but I forced myself to keep reading. I know you think I'm greedy. That's what you always say now, isn't it? That I only care about money. But I cared about that land because it was part of our family. It was supposed to be ours. You raised me on that farm. You taught me everything I know about it. You said once that it would always stay in the family. What changed, Grandma? When did I stop being part of that promise? Tears stung my eyes. For all his cruelty, there was a flicker of pain in those words, a trace of the boy I used to know, buried beneath years of anger and pride. But then the tone shifted. The next paragraph was darker. I hope you're happy watching the family name die. You let an outsider take what generations built. You let her poison your mind until you turned against your own blood. You think you've won, but you haven't. You just handed everything over to someone who doesn't deserve it. When she sells it off to pay her bills, when she bulldozes our memories, maybe then you'll realize what you've done. I could almost feel the venom in every stroke of his pen. His anger wasn't just about losing land, it was about losing control. Losing the story he wanted to tell about himself, the one where he inherited greatness instead of earning it. The final lines were shorter, messier, as if his composure had finally cracked. You taught me everything I know about that farm, Grandma. I hope you're happy watching it die with strangers. You could have trusted me, but you didn't. You'll regret that one day. Maybe not now, but you will. When you see what happens to the land, you'll think of me. I read the letter 3 times. Each time, the words hit differently, first like fire, then like ice, and finally like sorrow. Jake didn't understand. He never had. He thought the land was dying because it had changed hands. But what he didn't realize was that it had already been dying long before, every time greed took root where love should have been. I folded the letter carefully, smoothing the creases with my fingers. Then I stood, walked to the fireplace, and stared at the small flame flickering inside. For a moment, I hesitated. A part of me wanted to keep it to remember, to mourn, to prove that I'd tried. But then I realized I didn't need proof. I'd lived it. I held the paper over the flame. The edge curled almost immediately, blackening as the fire caught. The handwriting disappeared line by line, the ink turning to smoke, the words lifting into the air like ghosts finally released. When it was gone, I felt something leave me, not sadness, not relief, but closure. I stood there for a while, watching the ashes settle. Outside, I could hear the faint sound of laughter, Ellen's laughter drifting from the other side of the field. The farm was alive again, breathing, vibrant, full of love and life. That was something Jake would never understand. I went outside and walked along the fence line. The evening air was cool and soft, and the sky above was streaked with pink and orange. I looked toward Ellen's property, where she was feeding the animals, and I smiled. She noticed me and waved. I waved back, my heart full but steady. Later, I sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the stars emerge one by one. I thought about Jake's letter again, about how much energy he had spent blaming others for his own unhappiness. And then I thought about the life I had rebuilt, the simple, honest joy of waking up each morning to the sound of roosters, of tending to the soil, of knowing the land was finally in loving hands. The world doesn't always give us neat endings. People don't always learn the lessons we want them to. But that's not what forgiveness is. Forgiveness is releasing the weight someone else tried to put on your shoulders and choosing not to carry it anymore. So that's what I did. I let it go. As the last embers in the fireplace dimmed, I whispered softly into the quiet, almost like a prayer. The farm isn't dying, Jake. It's finally alive again. A year later, the farm looks different, but in the best possible way. It's early morning, the kind of morning that makes the whole world feel brand new. The sun hangs low, spilling soft light over the fields. Dew glistens on the wildflowers Ellen and I planted along the fences. The smell of freshly turned earth fills the air, and somewhere in the mostage, distance, a rooster crows late, but proud. I sit on the porch with a cup of coffee, wrapped in Harold's old flannel jacket, watching the farm come alive. The barn has a fresh coat of paint now. Ellen insisted on red, the same shade Harold loved. The garden is fuller than it's been in years, bursting with color and life. And where there used to be silence, now there's laughter, children's laughter. Ellen's Animal Rescue has become the heart of this land. Every weekend, families come to visit. Kids feed the goats, pet the horses, and run through the tall grass while their parents watch with smiles that remind me of simpler times. Ellen built a small education center near the barn, where she teaches people about caring for animals and respecting the land. Sometimes she jokes that she's turning my farm into a sanctuary for souls, not just strays. And maybe she's right. Watching her work fills me with pride, not because she's carrying on my legacy, but because she's created her own. The land feels alive again, as if it knows it's finally in good hands. I've aged more in this past year than I care to admit, but I've also grown lighter. There's a calmness in me now, the kind that comes after you've made peace with both the past and yourself. I tend the smaller things these days, the flower beds, the herb garden, the apple trees Harold planted decades ago. The big chores are Ellen's and her helpers now, though she still insists I'm the soul of the place. Sometimes I catch her saying to visitors, "This land has history, it's been loved, lost, and loved again." Every time she says it, I smile. She understands what this farm really means. Occasionally, I still think of Jake. Not with anger anymore, but with quiet sadness. I wonder where he is, if he's found peace, or if he's still chasing something that will never make him happy. I hope, in some small way, he's learned that what matters most in life can't be claimed or bought. It has to be nurtured. I haven't heard from him since the letter. At first, the silence felt heavy, but now it feels like closure. Sometimes, distance is the only kind of healing left. Nora called me once, months after everything had settled. Her voice was softer than before, tired, but gentler. She asked how I was doing, and I told her the truth, better than I've been in years. There was a pause on the line. Then she said, "Jake's moved away. He doesn't talk about it much." I nodded, though she couldn't see me. Maybe that's for the best. She didn't argue this time. Instead, she said quietly, "Mom, I think you did what you had to do." That was the closest thing to forgiveness I could have asked for. As the months passed, the farm began to transform in ways I could have never imagined. The fields that once lay half dead now glowed with golden wheat. The old barn, once falling apart, became a shelter for rescued horses and dogs. Even the air felt warmer, filled with life, laughter, and purpose. The community began to take notice. People who hadn't set foot on my property in years started coming by to volunteer. Schools organized field trips. The local newspaper ran a story titled, "New Life on Patterson Farm." I cut it out and tucked it into my journal, right next to the photo of Harold and me from our first harvest. One evening, Ellen and I sat on the porch watching the fireflies blink across the field. She leaned back and said, "Do you ever regret it, Ruth? Giving it all away?" I smiled. "No," I said. "Because I didn't lose it, I set it free." She was quiet for a long moment, then said, "You know, sometimes I think people don't own land. It owns us and it chooses who's worthy of it." I chuckled softly. "If that's true, then this land made the right choice." We sat there until the sky turned dark, the sound of crickets filling the air like a lullaby. It was one of those nights that made everything feel eternal, as if time itself had slowed just to let the earth breathe. The next morning, I woke to find Ellen and two of her volunteers putting up a new sign at the entrance of the property. The words were simple, painted in white letters across a deep green board. "The Patterson Sanctuary where love grows." I stood there for a long time, reading it over and over, tears blurring my vision. It wasn't just my name on that sign, it was my story, my heart, my redemption. I walked over to Ellen, who was hammering the last nail into the post. She turned, her face flushed from the morning sun, and smiled. "What do you think?" I touched the wooden frame, tracing the letters with my fingertips. "It's perfect," I said. "Harold would have loved it." She grinned. "Then it's exactly how it should be." As the sun rose higher, I looked out over the land, the fields, the barn, the laughter echoing in the distance, and I realized I wasn't leaving behind a broken legacy. I was leaving behind something alive, something that would outlast even memory. I still have moments when I imagine Jake driving by one day, maybe out of curiosity, maybe out of regret. I picture him slowing his car as he sees the new sign, the fresh paint, the joy spilling from the land he once thought he could own. Maybe he'll finally understand what he threw away. Because the truth is, I didn't take the farm from him. He gave it away himself the moment he let greed replace love. And if Jake ever drives by, I hope he sees the happiness he threw away and understands that family isn't about what you inherit but what you nurture.